right, folks. This is part 2 of the dollar hegemony. Henry C.K. Lou. But actually, this is actually the first part. Okay, this is part 1. I did part 3 about the dollar imperialism through gold and stuff like that, but this is going to be part 1. So, for all you currency geeks, here we go. Breaking free from dollar hegemony. China's dollar millstone, part 1. Henry C.K. Lou. The vast expansion of U.S.-led globalized trade since the Cold War ended in 1991 had been fueled by unsustainable serial debt bubbles built on dollar hegemony, which came into existence on a global scale with the emergence of deregulated global financial markets that made cross-border flows of funds routine since the 1990s. If you guys remember, this is when NAFTA and GATT, well, GATT really, but NAFTA, and then there were several other things, like the European Union really came into its own as a currency, as not a currency market, but as a economic market in the 1990s. You also had the same thing in Latin America. You also had something similar in Asia. The thing is, you didn't have it in Africa, which I thought was odd. Well, this was the connection of all these markets locally, was I should say locally as far as continents, and then after the continents linked up in global sections. But this is what he's talking about. Anyway, dollar hegemony is a geopolitically constructed peculiarity through which critical commodities, the most notable being oil, are denominated in fiat dollars, not backed by gold or any other species since President Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971. Nixon was actually forced off the gold standard by France. But if you read the book Gold, Dollars, and Power, you actually understand what happened with the dollar assets. The recycling of petrodollars into other dollar assets is the price the U.S. has extracted from oil-producing countries for U.S. tolerance of the oil exporting cartel since 1973. After that, everyone accepts dollars because dollars can buy oil, and every economy needs oil. And basically, every economy is an energy economy. Dollar hegemony separates the trade value of every currency from direct connection to the productivity of the issuing economy to link it directly to the size of dollar reserves held by the issuing central bank. In other words, the dollar replaced the gold standard, but with fiat dollars. Something we looked at what Britain did in the 19th century. Dollar hegemony enables the U.S. to own indirectly, but essentially the entire global economy by requiring its wealth to be denominated in fiat dollars that the U.S. can print at will with little in the way of monetary penalties. World trade is now a game in which the U.S. produces fiat dollars of uncertain exchange value and zero intrinsic value, and the rest of the world produces goods and services that fiat dollars can buy at market prices quoted in dollars. In other words, you force them to use dollars, and then you determine how much those goods and services are worth. Such market prices are no longer based on markups over production costs set by socioeconomic conditions in the producing country. They are kept artificially low to compensate for the effect of overcapacity in the global economy created by a combination of overinvestment and weak demand due to low wages in every economy. That's, in other words, race to the bottom. And also, I put down that it's not just market prices. But also, this dollar system also backed by force, which is something we're seeing now. Such low market prices in turn push further down already low wages to further cut costs in an unending race to the bottom. I just said that. The higher the production volume above market demand, in other words, flooding the market with goods, the lower the unit market price of a product must go in order to increase sales and volume to keep revenue from falling. In other words, they cut the price, so that means you have to produce more, and when you produce more, you cut the price, and you have to keep increasing sales and flooding the market to keep your revenue from falling, keep your economy alive. Lower market prices require lower production costs, which in turn puts wages down lower. Lower wages in turn further reduce demand. To prevent the loss of revenue from falling prices, producers must produce at a still higher volume, thus further lowering market prices and wages in a downward spiral. Exports economies are forced to compete for market share in the global market by lowering both domestic wages and the exchange rate of their currencies. That's why most of the world only makes $2 a day, because they've ground, this system, this dollar system, which the Europeans also benefit from, have ground down the rest of the world to the point where they're just basically working on survival wages constantly, and not for the wages that their labor should extract. Lower exchange rates look at this. Lower exchange rates pushed up the market price of commodities, which must be compensated for by even lower wages. The adverse effects of dollar hegemony on wages apply not only to the emerging export economies, but also to the importing U.S. economy. Workers all over the world are oppressed victims of dollar hegemony, which turns the labor theory of value upside down. That's how come since 1971, U.S. wages have been stagnant. U.S. wages the minimum wage used to be attached to an ounce of silver. And then back in, I think, the 1964, 65, an ounce of silver was $1.25, which was the minimum wage. An ounce of silver right now, I think the spot price is $16, which is supposed to be your minimum wage, if you think about it, or right around $15, which is what people are asking for. In the global market operating under dollar hegemony, the world's interlinked economies no longer trade to capture recording comparative advantage. The theory of comparative advantage espoused by British economist David Ricardo, for all you conservatives, asserts that trade can benefit all participating nations, even those that command no absolute advantage, because such nations can still benefit from specializing in producing products with the lowest opportunity cost, which is measured by how much production of another good needs to be reduced to increase production by one additional unit of that good. All right. I hope you economists understand that. I'm not even going to try. This theory reflected British national opinion in the 19th century, when free trade benefited Britain more than its trade partners. That's funny. When free trade when it benefits you more, you love it. When it doesn't benefit you, you hate it. As what we're seeing right now in this current age. However, in today's globalized trade, when factors of production such as capital, credit, technology, management, information, branding, distribution, and sales are mobile across national borders and can generate profit much greater than manufacturing, the theory of comparative advantage has a hard time holding up against measurable data. That's true. You have a different environment. So a lot of these theories don't work outside that environment. Under dollar hegemony, exporting nations compete in the global economy, the global market, to capture needed dollars to service dollar-denominated foreign and capital debt. The British did the same thing. To pay for imported energy, raw material, capital goods, to pay intellectual property fees and information technology fees. Moreover, their central banks must accumulate dollar reserves to ward off speculative attacks on the value of their currencies in the world markets. Venezuela and Iran have that problem, and also the Asian currency crisis when the West actually attacked the Asian currencies to get at China. The higher the market pressure to devalue a particular currency, the more dollar reserves in its banks and banks must hold. In other words, they're attacking a currency or attacking a group of currencies forces them to hold more, actually acquire more dollar reserves to actually protect the currency. Only the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, is exempt from this pressure to accumulate dollars because it can issue theoretically unlimited additional dollars at will with monetary immunity. The dollar is merely a Federal Reserve note, no more, no less. We all know that. So in other words, every other central bank has to hold a certain amount of dollar reserves except the Bank of International Settlement, which is basically the governor, and the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve can print as many dollars as it wants. And every other economy has to respond to that. We actually, in fact, there's Dr. Rasmus was just talking about that this week. Dollar hegemony has created a built-in support for a strong dollar that in turn forces the world's other central banks to acquire and hold more dollar reserves, making the dollar stronger, fueling a massive global debt bubble denominated in dollars as the U.S. becomes the largest debtor nation. In other words, the dollars are actually, currency is actually debt, because you're supposed to be able to use those dollars to actually buy something from the creditor, from the debtor nation. In other words, the rest of the world should be able to come to the United States and buy something with those dollars. But the thing is, under this system, basically it works in reverse. Dollars becomes a debt to those other nations. That's come the United States is the biggest debtor nation in the world. That's come if all those dollars come back to the United States. The United States would probably no longer exist as an economy. Anyway, yet a strong dollar, while viewed by U.S. authorities as the U.S. national interest, when they say national interest, that's what they mean. Protect the dollar. In reality, it drives a defacement of all fiat currencies that operate as a derivative currency of the dollar, in turn driving the current commodity-led inflation. When the dollar falls against the euro, it does not mean the euro is rising in purchasing power. It only means that the dollar is losing purchasing power faster than the euro. A strong dollar does not always mean higher dollar exchange rates. It only means that the dollars will stay firmly anchored as the prime reserve currency. Go ahead. Let's go ahead and underline that. For international trade, even as it falls. In other words, it's still going to be the main currency no matter what. And that is backed by that big-ass Navy and aircraft carriers. That's what the aircraft carriers are for. In recent decades, central banks of all governments, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve during Alan Greenspan's watch, had bought economic growth with loose money to feed debt bubbles. That's true. And to contain inflation with structural unemployment. We're not even going to talk about structural unemployment this time, which has been defined as up to 6% of the workforce to keep the labor market from being inflationary. That's true. The more people you put into the workforce, the value of labor goes down, but also you have to pay them at a certain rate, and that puts more dollars into circulation. Central banking has mutated from being an institution to safeguard the value of money so as to ensure wages from full employment do not lose purchasing power into one with a perverted mandate to promote and preserve dollar hegemony by releasing debt bubbles denominated in fiat dollars. Okay, we might look at that one, see the critique of central banking. We might look that up. Despite all the talk about globalization as an irresistible trend of progress, the priority for the United States in the final analysis has been to advance its superpower economic objectives, not its obligation as the center of global monetary system. Basically, they're in for themselves, not to be an arbiter of fair trade. This superpower economic objective includes the global expansion of U.S. economic dominance through dollar hegemony. Gold, dollars, and powers talked about that in the 50s. Reducing all domestic economies, including that of the U.S., to be merely local units of a global empire. Damn. Thus, when the U.S. asserts that a healthy and strong economy in Europe, Japan, and even Russia and China, all former enemies, is a part of Pax Americana, is essentially declaring a neo-colonial claim on these economies. In other words, we are the emperor, and basically all the other economies serve us, which they're fighting for right now. Remember, this is written in 2008. Way before what was going on right now. This is 11 years ago. The things have moved along quite a bit. But this is what you're fighting for. If you ever wonder what's going on, and now what they're actually fighting for, this explains it. This is the new Pax Americana, is the new world order that George Bush talked about in 1991. Which is the universal empire. I'm not going to write it down. The concept of stakeholder in the global geopolitical economic order advanced by Robert B. Zoellick, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and now President of the World Bank, is a solicitation from the U.S. to emergent economic powerhouses to support this. Pax Americana, the device for accomplishing this neo-imperialism, is a coordinated monetary policy managed by a global system of central banking. First adopted in the U.S. in 1913 to allow a financial elite to gain monetary control of the U.S. national economy. Very true, but also to prevent the banks from going under. After the Cold War, to allow the U.S. as the sole remaining superpower controlled by a financial oligarchy to gain monetary control over the entire globe. Boom. Boom. Can't say it any better. With the help of a supernatural institution such as the International Monetary Fund, this is another one that was set up under Bretton Woods, okay? And look at this, and the Bank of International Settlements, which was also set up by the United States in 1931. The U.S. aims to negate national economic sovereignty with the globalization of unregulated trade conducted under dollar hegemony. Unregulated trade globalization in the 21st century aims to neutralize national economic sovereignty to preempt national development financed by sovereign debt. Trade through export has become the sole operative path for national economic growth in a political world order of sovereign nation states that has existed since the Treaty of Westphalia, 1948. Kissinger had a book that really talks about the Treaty of Westphalia and the creation of modern states in his book, The World Order. He actually went through the whole thing about the development of modern states. It's actually a good book. Kissinger is actually brilliant if you ignore his personality. No national domestic economy can henceforth prosper without first adding to the prosperity of a U.S.-controlled global economy denominated in dollars. So in other words, you can't prosper without paying, how can I say, tribute to the king, to the emperor, which is the United States. Holy Dollar Empire. Echoing the Holy Roman Empire, the global economy has been operating as a global Holy Dollar Empire, with the Federal Reserve as the Holy Dollar Emperor. Similar to the Holy Roman Empire, which disintegrated from the rise of Lutheran nationalism, this Holy Dollar Empire, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. This is gold, folks. This Holy Dollar Empire will eventually disintegrate from progressive centrifugal forces of new populist economic nationalism. Bitcoin. This disintegration of the SWIFT. You're seeing it now. What he talked about 11 years ago, you're seeing it now. This new nationalism is not to be confused with regressive trade protectionism. The formation of the new group of five, and this is, look at this, China, Brazil, India, Mexico, and South Africa, and the group of 8 summit in Tokyo, G8, the US, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the European Union, is a new sign of this trend of progressive economic nationalism. The 2008 U.S. presidential election may herald it in a new populism in history to reform the structure of the U.S. debt. I think Obama didn't do it, but I think Trump is doing it, if that makes sense. Anyway, continuing. In his speech to the G5 leaders, President Hu Jintao said it is necessary to take into full account the issue of food security in tackling the challenges in energy, climate change, and other fields. Apart from calling the setting up of the UN-led international cooperation mechanism and global food security safeguard system, Hu said all countries should strengthen cooperation in grain reserves, a process of proven success in China, but not recommended by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which views such scheme as a distortion. In other words, what Hu said doesn't line up with dollar hegemony, because it distorts free trade, or what they believe is free trade, which is not free trade. Liberation from this holy dollar empire of the dollar hegemony, can only come from sovereign nations withdrawing. Look at this. Sovereign nations withdrawing from the global central banking regime and return to a national banking regime within a world order of sovereign nation states, to put monetary policy back in its proper role of supporting national development goals, rather than sacrificing national development to support global dollar hegemony through a wage suppression exports. In other words, instead of being feeder nations to the United States and Europe, you're actually developing yourself to build your own nations, instead of trying to send your resources and your labor with your sweat equity out someplace else. Africa's going through that right now. See how far we're going to actually go with this. In a world order of sovereign nation states, the supranational nature of central banking will render it inoperative, as it can only be and has been used as an all-controlling device for the world's rich nations to neutralize the sovereign rights of the financially weak nations. We've seen that with Venezuela and Iran. In a democratic world order, central banking is also inoperative within national borders, as it can be used by a nation's rich as a device to deny working poor of the economic rights. We're looking at it right now, folks. They did that over the last 20 years. Central banking, in its support of the dollar hegemony, operates internationally in opposition to the economic interests of sovereign nation states, and domestically in opposition to the economic rights of the working poor by discrediting enlightened economic nationalism as undesirable protectionism. In other words, the central banking system as it's set up actually supports this bastardized version of Bretton Woods, and only the inverse of it, which is Bitcoin and getting off the system, is actually putting the hands back into the hands of the people. And also I put down a race about actually automation is accelerating this, whereas actually taking the rights of the working poor away. To preserve dollar hegemony, exporting economies that accumulate large dollar reserves through trade surpluses are forced by the United States to revalue their currency upward, not to redress the trade imbalance. In other words, trade is supposed to be balanced, right? But by exchange of goods and services or tech or whatever, or resources, right? But what the United States does is plays the game, and actually you have to make your currency stronger to actually reduce the amount of debt. That makes sense. Which is the result of a dysfunctional terms of trade rather than an operative exchange rates, but to reduce the value in foreign local currency terms of U.S. debt assumed at previously stronger dollar exchange rates. When the commodity prices rise, it reflects a defacement of all fiat currencies led by the dollar as a benchmark. When the currency of another nation rises against the dollar, it does not mean, we see this before, that the currency can buy more. It only means that the dollar can buy less than what the appreciating currency can buy. In other words, it devalues the dollar. So basically, instead of getting a fair exchange for what you traded for in dollar terms, when they have to revalue the dollar, those dollars that you accumulated are actually worth less. So you don't get a fair exchange. So actually come out by holding dollars and then revaluing your currency upward makes the dollars weak. So the dollar denominated assets that you hold are actually worth less. And this is how they manipulate the trade up and down. And if you don't cotton to it, you become a Venezuela or Argentina or a few others. It said this is why commodity prices have been rising in all currencies, albeit at different rates. The bursting of the latest dollar-denominated debt bubble created a global credit crisis in August 27. Do you remember when I played there's a reason that I played Kramer going nuts Bear Stearns, because that's when the bubble burst. People think it's 2008, but it's actually August 2007. Actually, I think Kramer went off in July. Might have been July. But August is when everybody stops. Exporting economies around the world are now forced to reconsider the dysfunctional strategy of seeking growth through exports for fiat dollars that are pushing the world's economy towards hyperinflation. It's already happened, leading all other fiat currencies in depreciation and with a race to the bottom. Beggar thy neighbor. All right, we're not gonna read this because now I'm gonna read this stuff because it talks about a lot of stuff, but I don't think it's I don't think it's necessary now, because when one is old and two is specific to a time, to something, to that time period, and it's not good for a video, so I'm not going to read that. Chinese exports are slowing because of reduced global growth caused by developing U.S. recession. That's true. While imports are rising on the back of rising commodity prices. These figures are not inflation adjusted. However, they reflect the rising exchange value of the yuan. In other words, exports have been falling more in yuan terms. The fall in exports is expected to accelerate as no market analyst of worth is projecting any quick or sharp recovery in the U.S. economy. And it hasn't. Going forward, the ratio of nominal GDP to PPP-GDP can be expected to fall as China's domestic inflation rate continues to exceed the U.S. inflation rate. This trend will gain momentum as China attempts to use its trade surplus denominated in dollars for domestic development, which it has, which requires it to issue more yuan to the Chinese money supply. And market pressure can be expected to push the yuan down against the dollar until the Chinese inflation rate is at parity with the U.S. inflation rate. Yeah, that's going to be a while. It still hasn't happened. But a falling exchange rate causes more domestic inflation from imports denominated in dollars. And a rise in domestic inflation adds pressure to a falling exchange rate in a downward spiral, preventing the yuan from rising against the dollar from market forces. In fact, Rasmus was actually talking about that, like I said, this week. That is the dysfunctionality of the yuan-dollar exchange rate regime in relation to the inflation rate differentials between the two economies. In other words, as you inflate, your currency becomes less. When the exchange rate is set by trade imbalance denominated dollars. This dysfunctionality is caused by the flawed attempt to use exchange rates to compensate for dysfunctional terms of trade, which has been mostly caused by wage disparity. And yeah, because the exchange rate is flawed because, especially back then, where the average worker in the United States made approximately, like right around, I think it's $18 to $20 an hour, and the average wage of the Chinese back then, I think it was like maybe $4 or $5 an hour, if that. So, in other words, there's an imbalance. In other words, they can't buy the goods that they produce, or buy goods from a larger nation, because of the wage disparity. The goods that we produce is too much. It costs too much for them to buy. So there's no equal exchange. So there's a great imbalance, which mercantilists like Nike and Apple and all those kind of folks take advantage of. Stagflation danger. Li Ying, a leading Chinese economist, former president of the Ganghua School of Management at Beijing University, and member of the Standing Committee of the 11th National Committee of the Chinese People's the country's political advisory body, opined in the second meeting of the Standing Committee on July 4, 2008, that China is facing a pressing challenge in preventing inflation from turning into stagflation, which is something that the United States did in the 70s, and we're facing it right now. The dual evils of high unemployment along with high inflation. If market expectation concludes with Chinese policymakers will fail to insulate the economy from the developing global slowdown, which is expected to deepen next year, which it did, with no prospect of a quick recovery, which it wasn't. Let's skip down. Lee argues that China should decelerate the pace of capital and foreign exchange uh, decontrol within the context of an oncoming, protracted global economic slowdown to preserve the value of its huge foreign exchange reserves in UN terms. He wants the government to avoid being misguided by the static concept of fixed low inflation rate target rates of 3%. Yeah, we will not even talk about why the 3% matters. Rather, an inflation rate of up to 60% of the economic growth should be permissible. Wow, okay. Meaning to allow that the inflation rate at around 6% for a 10% growth rate. In other words, let the he wants the wages to rise and start equaling out or balancing out the first world. China's inflation rate hit an 11-year high of 8.7%. I'm talking about 8% growth in February 2008 and eased to 7.7% in May, still high above the government set goal of 3% annualized. Lee points out that the incoming economic data show that the Chinese economy is on sound footing despite new challenges from abroad and at home. Lee's advice is sensible. It serves no useful purpose to cause a collapse of the economy to fight inflation, as Paul Volcker did in the U.S. in the 1980s, making the cure worse than the disease. Still, Volcker was facing a 20% inflation rate in 1980, which might have justified drastic action. That's true. Once you went off the gold standard, in the fiat currency inflation rate actually ran wild, and all those dollars start coming back. So if anybody remembers that in the late 70s and early 80s, the interest rate, the Fed rate was damn near 18%, which the interest rates were actually running at 21%. And it did crush the economy. But that is a different story. Yet Lee should recognize that under a dollar hegemony, Chinese central bankers must try to keep Chinese inflation rate target below 3% to stay on par with the dollar inflation rate set by the U.S. Federal Reserve, the head of the world central bank snake. At 6%, a 6% inflation rate in China will be more than triple the current inflation rates target set by the U.S. Central Bank, the defender of the dollar hegemony, even as it allows the dollar exchange rate to fall. A Chinese inflation rate of 6%, as proposed by Lee, will cause market forces to push the yuan down against the dollar, further exacerbating the U.S. trade tension and reviving protectionist pressure in the U.S., which it did, especially under Trump. Obama really didn't do it, but Trump did. As China is being pressured relentlessly by the U.S. to further revalue the yuan upward against the dollar, yuan interest rates must rise above Chinese inflation rates. At a 6% interest rate for the yuan, the disparity with the dollar interest rate would cause hot money denominated in dollars to rush into China through the carry trade to profit from the interest rate arbitrage, betting on continuing Chinese government intervention to keep the yuan from falling against the dollar despite higher Chinese inflation. With a 6% inflation rate, China will be forced to pay currency traders massive sums to defend an overvalued yuan dictated by U.S. trade policy, in a contradiction of the U.S. Treasury policy of a strong dollar. In other words, what would happen is that if interest rates are like 2% in the United States and 6% in China, basically a bunch of money will rush in to a bunch of dollars will rush into China to actually take advantage of the inflation rate. So you get a big flood of money, hot money coming into the economy that will actually cause the inflation actually spike in that economy, and then drive down the value of your currency. So to defend the currency, you're going to have to pay the interest rates, the arbitrage in the hot money to actually keep your currency stable. I understand what he's saying. A lot of your African countries actually do that. That was how the Bank of England allowed itself to be broken by George Soros on Black Wednesday, September 16, 1992, when the British Central Bank attempted in vain to defend an overvalued pound sterling out of sync with its interest rate regime. It was also how Hong Kong government was forced to execute its incursion into the equity market in August 1998 to defend the Hong Kong dollars pegged to the U.S. dollar against market fundamentals. That is the Asian currency crisis. We might do the Asian currency crisis, because there is actually a paper by the CEPR about the Asian currency crisis. We might. It's actually a long paper, so if I do it, it won't be on here. It'll be on Patreon, but you guys will let me know. China has been forced to take steps to offset the impact of the U.S. Fed's easy money policy on the Chinese economy. The U.S. Fed has cut the Fed funds rate target 8 times since September 18th, 2007, from 5.75% to 2%. That's a long story. On April 30th. And the discount rate 9 times since August 17th, 2007, from 6.25% to 2.25% on April 30th. Although China's central bank has issued notes to absorb excess liquidity, market pressure still exists from the central bank to put more currency into circulation to add to already excessive liquidity, causing inflation. China's central bank has increased interest rates 6 times and the bank reserve ratio 15 times since 2007, but Shanghai interbank rates have increased only slightly, signaling a major resistance to monetary policy. All right, we're going to skip down and get into something that I actually want to touch on. This is actually a very long paper, and we're nearing almost an hour. Most commercial paper, the market that precipitated the credit crisis in August 2007, is issued under Section 3 of the 1933 Act, which exempts from registration requirements from short-term securities within certain characteristics. The exemption requirements have been a factor in shaping characteristics of the commercial paper market. Private equity firms with fewer than 15 investors and hedge funds, even though they may control billions of equity and multi-billions of credit, are not regulated by the SEC. When the Federal Reserve and other central banks have taken crisis-induced action since August 2007 to calm markets and to get market participants to believe that the financial system will continue to operate normally. In other words, basically revive confidence in the market. Market indicators such as the London Interbank offered rate, LIBOR, on which SHIBOR is modeled, suggest that the Fed's message has not been accepted by the market participants. In other words, they don't believe them. The LIBOR, a global benchmark, normally trades predictably at only a few basis points, hundredths of a percentage point, above the federal funds rate. It is a traded version of the Fed's funds rate. As such, it is an important benchmark for determining lending rates on big corporate deals, mortgages, and other lending markets. LIBOR has been out of normal alignment with the Fed funds rate since the credit crisis began in 2007. Actually, it began before that. It began in 2006. But continuing, the Fed and the European Central Bank have already been greasing the markets by adding additional liquidity through reserve operations. When the credit crisis broke, the 1-month Libor was traded at an abnormally high 5.82% when the Fed funds rate target rate was 5.25%, a 57 basis point spread, and the Fed discount rate was cut 50 basis points to 5.75%. The Fed has since cut the Fed funds rate target from 5.25% to its current 2%, and the discount rate from 2.24% to 2.25%. But the spread between Fed funds rate and Libor has not narrowed. The 3-month Libor was trading at 2.75% as of July 11, 2008, 75 basis points above the Fed rate. In other words, they don't trust the banks, so banks have to pay a premium for overnight lending. It means banks are not willing to lend short-term money to each other for fear of counterparty default, which happened with Bears and Lehman. Also, as part of the general tightening as the current credit crisis, banks have been hoarding cash to respond to the frozen asset-backed commercial paper market. That's how come they had to do it. The paper market was actually frozen, which is why you had to have TARP, and Obama came into office, and there's a whole big backstory behind that. I'm not going to go into it here. Many European banks have committed to credit lines to big issuers of this paper. You had to, in other words, European central banks had to step in and actually become liquidity for this paper, because the normal banking system couldn't be done between banks anymore. So instead of the Libor, where banks actually sent money back and forth to each other, actually funded this paper, the Fed and the other central banks had to step in and do it. Otherwise, everything would have locked up, which it did. But that's many European banks have committed to credit lines to big issuers of this paper, and because nobody wants to take on more of that paper, those paper issuing companies are forced to borrow from banks using their bank credit lines, making banks need more cash to build up required reserves. In other words, it started draining the reserves. With more than $1 trillion of commercial paper set to come due every 6 weeks since August 20, 2007, and more than $700 billion. Remember $700 billion? That's TARP right there. As of June 2008, that's your TARP, $700 billion. You wonder where your TARP money went? Now you're looking at it. Banks are reluctant to tie up their reserves lending to other banks, even at rates that would normally seem extremely attractive. There was a lot of bad paper. At present, lending and deposit interest rates are regulated in China with a floor lending rate and ceiling deposit rate. Central banker Yi said, when clients complain about high interest rates, commercial banks can pass the buck to the central bank because the central bank sets the interest floor. When Shibor matures, Shibor will become the culprit, just like the Federal Reserve is. Ye see market-based interest rate coming from deregulation. If the central bank deregulates deposits rate ceiling and lending rate floor when there is no other reliable benchmark to substitute them, the result could be worse. In other words, if you don't have anything set in it, it'll be worse. It'll be all over the place and you have chaos. When is the right timing for deregulation? Probably in a better, calmer market, which it is not. The answer is when the new benchmark matures. In other words, they're saying Shibor will be that. In other words, when you have a different financial system controlled by different people. An interest rate floor and ceiling are likely to exist for some period. Can the market-based interest rate transformation process start with the discount rate linking with Shibor? In other words, when can we transfer all this stuff over to us? In fact, discount facilities are loans. That's true. A breakthrough with the discount rate will have far-reaching impact on market-based interest rate transformation, provided experience for the future interest rate reform, according to Yi. All right. Let's see. One more thing, and we'll close this out. Chinese equity markets have been taking a beating in recent months. The Shanghai Composite fell from a peak of 6,124 in mid-October 2007 down a third, to 2,566 in early July 2008, a fall of 58%, due largely to the rising exchange value of the yuan and market pressure on yuan interest rates to keep lenders from cutting off loans at negative interest rates. If the yuan becomes freely convertible and tradable, China will be receiving 3% interest on its sizable dollar reserves, currently at $1.8 trillion, while paying 6% interest on a much larger yuan deposit. In other words, they will be losing half of their. In other words, they would be losing money because their dollar reserves they'll be getting half their money on the dollar reserves, and then not actually paying out 3% on yuan deposits, which is why they want, and they're trying to keep the interest rates down. By seeking growth through exports for dollars, China has trapped itself in an incurable mismatch between necessary domestic macroeconomic policies to assure sustainable growth and a central bank's monetary policies dictated by a dollar hegemony. All right, I think we're gonna read this and then we're gonna close it out. Because it's almost an hour. We're gonna end with this. And as China liberalizes its interest rate regime and currency convertibility, as advised by neoliberal economists whose credibility has been bankrupted by the unfolding events. That's funny. The Chinese economy will face another financial crisis that will wipe out a good part of the export-led financial and economic gains in the last decade, which is why they've shifted, which is why Belt and Road exists. All exporting economies that have been abandoned capital control since the emergence of deregulated globalization of financial markets have been regularly devastated by recurring financial crises that have imploded every decade. The last being in the 1987 market crash, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and the 2007 credit crisis. In other words, since you delinked the dollar from gold, that's what they're saying. Capital controls. The latest crisis has yet to fully play out in its destructiveness, and there are no signs so far that U.S. policymakers trapped in a dysfunctional supply-side ideology have the economic wisdom and political dexterity to prevent it from turning into a global depression, which it did. China was relatively spared in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, largely due to its then cautious pace of opening up its financial sector to global market forces, reacting to dollar hegemony. This time around, China can only insulate itself from the pattern of global financial crisis by making a concerted effort to shift its exports to the domestic market and reduce substantially its trade dependency from the current near 70% to below 30%. In other words, get off this export track. In other words, stop being the factory of the world and actually take the lead that Britain and the United States did in their time. In a planned manner and an orderly schedule, exports should be returned by policy into an augmentation role in the economy. Supporting domestic development should be the main focus of economic growth. The domestic sector should no longer be made to sacrifice to support the export sector. Exports should support domestic development and not as a parasite on domestic development. This can be done by legally requiring payment of all Chinese exports to be denominated in yuan, and stop the unproductive role of exporting for dollars that cannot be spent domestically without incurring a heavy monetary policy. Can we say Bitcoin? This is why they support Bitcoin. Anyway, it's been almost an hour. I hope you guys get something out of it. We got most of it. We got this page 10. We got a page 10. If you guys want me to finish it, you guys will let me know. It's only like a couple more pages, like 3 more pages. And I'm tired of reading. So, I'm going to end this one, you guys. I hope you guys get something out of it. This is part 1, but part 2. There's 3 more parts. Let me know if you guys want me to continue it. If not, I'll understand. But for my currency geeks, this is a continuation of Henry C.K. Lew, my reading of it. I don't know if you can find this, because I've tried to find it on the site and I didn't see it. Maybe it's still up there, because it's not on Asia Times. Asia Times kind of purged all this old stuff. I'm not even gonna say why I think they did it, but the thing is, they reorganized the site, and a lot of this old good stuff doesn't exist anymore. But this is all I got for this one. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.